The first scream shattered the Sunday calm like a grenade going off. Colonel Mason Hartwell didn't even hesitate. Years of battlefield reflexes took over before the civilian parts of his mind could catch up. His garden hose hit the ground, spraying a lazy arc of water into the sky as he bolted toward the driveway where the sound had come from. It was supposed to be a morning of peace in Silver Lake Meadows, Colorado, the kind of morning you tell yourself you've earned after a lifetime of sacrifice. Mason had pictured sipping coffee on the porch, watching his 10-year-old daughter Sophie pedal slow circles around their cul-de-sac, her laughter blending with the hum of sprinklers and the distant bark of dogs. Instead, he saw two men in tactical vests snatching Sophie off her bright purple bicycle. They moved with the precision of predators. One tall and wiry, the other broad-shouldered and red-bearded. Both wore black Community Integrity Force vests stenciled hastily in white block letters. No badges. No official insignia. No real authority. The white SUV they had arrived in had no license plates, no HOA decal. It should have been the first clue to any bystander, but fear has a way of freezing good people into spectators. Mason's boots pounded the asphalt. "Let her go," he roared. Redbeard ignored him. He hoisted Sophie up by her arms like she was nothing more than contraband, her helmet clattering to the pavement. Sophie screamed again, a raw, primal sound no parent should ever have to hear. The wiry man stepped between Mason and his daughter, leveling a cheap plastic taser in Mason's direction. "Back off, sir. This is official HOA business." Mason skidded to a stop, fist clenched. His mind calculated options at blinding speed. Distance, weapon reach, threat levels. He could close the gap before the man fired. He was certain of it. But at what cost? A misstep and Sophie would pay the price. He raised his hand slowly, voice ice calm despite the fury burning inside him. "You're making a mistake." Unregistered recreational equipment on private property, Redbeard barked like he was reading from a script. Violation 3.7a. Subject must be processed. Before Mason could object, before he could demand to see credentials or supervisors, or anything that might slow them down, Sophie was shoved into the back seat of the SUV. The door slammed shut. Mason lunged. The taser snapped. Agony tore through his chest and limbs like wildfire. He hit the ground hard, face grinding into the driveway gravel he'd swept clean just the day before. His body seized uncontrollably. His vision tunneled. Through the ringing in his ears, he caught one last sound, the screech of tires as the SUV peeled away, taking Sophie with it. And then there was only silence. The kind of silence that comes after disaster. When Mason came to, a shadow loomed over him, Mrs. Delaney from across the street, cordless phone shaking in her hand. "I called 911, she said, voice cracking. They said it might be a jurisdiction issue. HOA authority or something." Mason didn't hear the rest. He pushed himself upright, his muscles spasming, his scraped palms slipping against the driveway. "Sophie," he rasped. Mrs. Delaney's eyes filled with tears. She shook her head helplessly. The normal Mason Hartwell, the polite suburban father, died right there on that driveway. The man who rose in his place was something else entirely. He staggered into his house, bleeding and electrified with rage, and dragged his old military laptop from the safe. His fingers, still trembling, flew across the keys. Encryption programs hummed to life. Firewall databases unlocked. He called one man, Sawyer. A name from the old days. A ghost from the wars nobody talked about anymore. "Talk to me," Sawyer said without preamble. "They took my daughter," Mason said flatly. "Fake HOA. Tasered me in broad daylight. SUV. No plates." Sawyer was silent for one beat. Then, on it. Within 30 minutes, Mason had traffic cam captures, gas station security footage, and crucially, a partial VIN number snagged in a reflection off the SUV's side panel. It was a lead Mason wasn't about to waste. The old Silver Lake outlet sat abandoned at the edge of town, a skeleton of a shopping dream long since collapsed. Nature had started to reclaim it, weeds growing through cracked pavement, windows broken by time and teenagers. It was there Mason found the SUV. And it was there he found them, not two men now, but five, unloading crates from the back of the vehicle under a rusted awning that bore a faded, peeling banner, Community Integrity Force Processing Center. No permits, no registrations, nothing legal. A phantom operation. And inside, through the cracked window of what used to be a Payless shoe store, he saw her. Sophie, huddled on a stained mattress, zip ties binding her tiny wrists, terror frozen across her dirt-streaked face. Mason didn't feel fear. He didn't feel hesitation. He felt purpose. Pure, burning purpose. And if these men thought they had abducted just another suburban kid, they were about to find out they had kidnapped the wrong little girl. The wrong family. The wrong damn soldier. Mason didn't rush. Rushing was how you got yourself killed in Baghdad back in '07, or in Fallujah during the Black Days when chaos reigned and every corner could hide a sniper. No, speed was the enemy now. What he needed was precision. From behind a dumpster reeking of mildew and decay, he mapped the ground. 5 hostiles. 2 at the loading dock, unloading what looked like locked plastic bins. 1 patrolling the perimeter lazily, his head on a swivel but clearly bored. 2 more inside, close to Sophie. He studied the SUV again. Keys dangling from the ignition. A careless mistake. Mason cataloged it without emotion. He checked his watch. No backup yet. Langston was still an hour away at least. Hauling a private team across state lines without drawing heat wasn't easy. Mason had no illusions about the legality of what he was about to do. He wasn't thinking about charges, lawsuits, optics. They had taken his daughter. There would be no compromise. The perimeter man wandered a little too close to Mason's hiding spot, yawning as he scratched his neck. Mason moved like a ghost. A quick grab, a sharp twist, and the man slumped silently behind the dumpster, breathing but out cold. 1 less. Mason snagged the man's cheap walkie-talkie and earpiece, tucking them into his pocket. Static crackled. The signal was an encrypted, amateur hour. Unit 3, status? A voice squawked. Mason clicked the mic once, a quick, universal, all clear, and tactical radio speak, and moved. He slipped along the shattered walls of the outlet mall like a shadow. He remembered moving through bombed-out hospitals in Mosul, through markets where every basket of fruit could hide a mine. This wasn't new. Only the stakes were more personal. He crept to the side window where Sophie was held. Through the cracked glass, he saw her curled up, whimpering quietly. One of the men, Redbeard, sat nearby counting cash bundles with casual arrogance. Mason's vision darkened at the edges, but he stayed steady. He counted down silently in his mind. 5 seconds. 4. 3. A deep rumble. Headlights. Down the cracked access road, a black Suburban rolled into view. Silent, predatory, and exactly on time. Langston. The operation shifted instantly. The guards at the dock tensed, hands drifting to weapons. They barked orders into radios. The man counting cash stood up, reaching for a taser. That was their mistake. Because while they were looking at the front, Mason came through the side. He smashed the window with a single punch wrapped in his jacket sleeve, clearing it in one brutal sweep. Sophie gasped but stayed still. Smart girl, brave girl. Mason swung into the room like a hammer wrapped in human skin. Redbeard turned, fumbling for his weapon. Too slow. Mason drove his fist into the man's gut, folding him like an accordion, then dropped him with a brutal uppercut that cracked teeth. The taser clattered harmlessly to the floor. Sophie shrieked and scrambled back. Mason was on her in 2 strides, his hands shaking as he pulled a multi-tool from his belt and snapped through the plastic zip ties. "You're okay," he whispered fiercely. "I've got you." She nodded, tears streaking her dirty face. Langston's team stormed through the main entrance like a battering ram. The fake guards barely had time to react. Flashlights blinded them. Combat-trained men wrestled them to the ground. One reached for a weapon and caught a boot to the temple instead. The chaos was over in under 90 seconds. Mason carried Sophie outside into the cool night air. Langston joined him, nodding grimly. "You want us to call it in?" Mason shook his head. "Not yet," he said. "First, we get names." The 5 men were zip-tied and kneeling on the cracked concrete, trembling under the gaze of real warriors. Mason paced in front of them slowly, every inch the soldier he used to be. Sophie sat nearby, wrapped in a warm jacket one of Langston's men had brought, a medic checking her for injuries. "You know who I am?" Mason asked quietly. Blank stares. "You will." He crouched down in front of Redbeard, who glared back with a mask of defiance already cracking. "Tell me who you work for," Mason said. Silence. Langston cracked his knuckles in a way that suggested very bad things could happen if the silence continued. Redbeard broke first. He always would. Mason could see it, the panic sweat starting at the temples, the slight tremor in the hands. "They call it Community Integrity Force," he blurted. "It's a side hustle, man. Easy money." Mason leaned in. "Who funds it?" "Some HOA guys," Redbeard gasped. "Board members. They turn a blind eye. We grab a kid, fake a fine, say it's non-compliance. Parents pay to make it go away. Everyone wins." Mason's stomach turned. "And if they don't pay?" he asked. They get compliance enforced, Redbeard mumbled, unable to meet his eyes. It wasn't just extortion. It was systemic, organized, targeted at families too scared to fight back. A cancer hiding under the false flag of suburban order. Mason stood slowly. You're going to write down every name, every address, every transfer, he said, or you'll wish you had. And they did. Trembling hands scrawled lists and maps and drop-off locations across Mason's notepad. Langston leaned over his shoulder, reading. You're gonna burn this whole town down, he muttered. Mason nodded once. They thought they could terrorize my daughter, he said. His voice was quiet, but it carried all the weight of a war drum. Now I'm going to dismantle their entire empire. That night, after Sophie was safely back home, sleeping under a mountain of blankets, Mason stood on his porch in the darkness, arms crossed, surveying the cul-de-sac with a soldier's gaze. No more illusions of peace. There would be justice. Not just for Sophie. For every neighbor who ever got a fake fine. For every elderly couple harassed over a garden hose. For every child ripped from their bike in the name of compliance. The war wasn't over. It was just getting started. And this time, Mason Hartwell wasn't taking prisoners. Mason knew that striking in the shadows wasn't enough. To truly destroy this cancer, he had to drag it into the light, expose it where everyone could see, where lies crumbled under the weight of undeniable truth. And there was only one place to do that, the Silver Lake Meadows HOA annual meeting. It was scheduled for Saturday morning at the community center, a sterile, beige building where, until now, board members had spent more time discussing flower bed regulations than real human lives. But this Saturday, it wouldn't be about hedges or mailboxes. It would be about blood. The morning of the meeting, Mason dressed with ritual precision. Not jeans and a hoodie like some angry parent would wear. No, today demanded the full weight of his past. He pulled on his formal Army service uniform, deep blue jacket, sharply creased trousers, polished brass buttons catching the sunlight. His ribbons, earned across decades of deployments and battles, gleamed across his chest. His rank insignia, Colonel, sat proud and unyielding on his shoulders. When he walked out onto his front porch, neighbors watering their lawns froze, eyes wide. A few saluted instinctively. One woman clutched her chest and whispered, God bless him. Mason offered no smile, no wave. He simply got into his truck, a battered old Silverado that still bore desert dust in its seams, and drove toward war. The community center parking lot was packed. Cars lined the streets, double-parked in desperation. The HOA had promised a casual gathering to discuss recent rumors, but fear had done what monthly newsletters never could. It had mobilized the entire neighborhood. Mason parked at the edge of the lot, engine ticking as it cooled. He sat for a moment, breathing slow and deep, centering himself. Across the lot, he spotted Paul Denton, the HOA president, standing stiffly on the steps, pale and sweating under his khakis and golf shirt. A puppet waiting for strings to snap. Mason stepped out, and the world shifted. People turned. Phones lifted. A hush rippled across the crowd as residents whispered his name, some not even knowing why they were whispering it. He didn't rush. He didn't need to. The uniform carried him forward like a tide. Inside the center, the room was already tense. Rows of plastic chairs were filled with anxious homeowners, arms crossed, mouths tight. The board, Paul Denton and his cronies, sat at a cheap folding table up front, shuffling papers, avoiding eye contact. Paul cleared his throat into a microphone. Good morning, everyone. Let's, begin with addressing some recent misunderstandings regarding community compliance procedures. Mason didn't wait for permission. He walked straight down the aisle, every eye locked onto him, and stepped onto the low platform where the board sat. He took the microphone from Paul's trembling hand without a word. My name is Colonel Mason Hartwell, United States Army, retired, he said, voice cutting through the stale air like a blade. And I'm here today because my daughter was abducted from our street by criminals pretending to represent this board. Gasps. Several people stood up involuntarily. A woman dropped her phone. Somewhere in the back, a man whispered, Oh my God. Paul Denton half rose from his chair. Now, Colonel Hartwell, let's not make wild accusations. Mason didn't even look at him. Instead, he pulled a small Bluetooth speaker from his pocket and tapped play. A recording filled the room scratchy, but clear. Just let the community integrity force handle it. If something goes wrong, it's not on us. We're just approving compliance operations, not kidnapping anyone. Paul's voice. Undeniable. The room erupted. A woman screamed, They threatened my son over a soccer net. An old man shouted, They tried to fine me $5,000 for a faded garage door. Mason raised a hand and the room fell silent again. "I have more," he said calmly. He opened a binder, thick and heavy with evidence. Wire transfers from Community Integrity Force to personal accounts belonging to board members. Fake violation notices rubber-stamped without legal review. Audio recordings of secret meetings where compliance operations were greenlit in exchange for kickbacks. He flipped through each page methodically, a general presenting battlefield intelligence before launching a final assault. "Every single one of you was a target," Mason said, sweeping his gaze across the stunned crowd. "Your families, your savings, your safety. And the men responsible," he added, turning toward Paul Denton and the others, "sit right here among you." The back doors of the center burst open. Not the local Silver Lake police. Mason had bypassed them, knowing their tangled ties with the HOA leadership. No, this was heavier. 2 men and a woman in dark suits entered, flashing federal badges. Department of Justice, Special Task Force on Community Fraud and Extortion. Langston stood just behind them, arms folded, smirking slightly. Paul Denton tried to stand, to explain, but one of the agents spoke sharply. "Paul Denton, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit kidnapping, extortion, wire fraud, and multiple counts of organized racketeering. You have the right to remain silent." Handcuffs snapped around his wrists. Residents cheered. Tears streamed down faces. Old rivals embraced like old war buddies reunited on a battlefield long thought lost. The other 2 board members, red-faced and shaking, were led out alongside Denton. One of them would himself on the way down the aisle. Mason watched it all with the cold detachment of a man who had fought far uglier wars. He didn't smile. Justice wasn't something you celebrated. It was something you enforced. As the agents led the criminals away, a wave of sound built inside the center, a roar of applause, of cathartic, ragged cheers that shook the cheap ceiling tiles. Someone shouted, "Hartwell for HOA president." Mason shook his head, holding up a hand. "I didn't do this to run anything," he said. "I did it because you deserved better." He set the binder down on the podium. "And now," he added, voice low but carrying through the stunned, humbled crowd, "it's your turn to make sure this never happens again." The applause rose again, not just for him, but for themselves, for the beginning of something new. Real community, real integrity, not the lies they'd been fed for years. Outside, as the late morning sun burned away the last of the mist clinging to Silver Lake meadows, Mason stood with Sophie by his side. She clutched his hand, still fragile, but stronger than before. He looked down at her, his reason for everything, and squeezed gently. And for the first time since the war, Mason Hartwell allowed himself a small, tired smile. Not because it was over, but because, for the first time in a very long time, it felt like it could be. The trial wasn't just a courtroom drama. It became a movement. By the time the first hearing for the state versus Denton, Harris, and Shaw opened at the Silver Lake County Courthouse, the story had traveled far beyond Colorado. News vans choked the parking lots. National anchors staked out positions on the courthouse steps, buzzing about the HOA abduction scandal that had electrified neighborhoods across America. Inside, the atmosphere was electric, a low, simmering pressure that made every breath feel thick. The gallery was packed with homeowners from Silver Lake Meadows, neighboring towns, even people who had driven hours just to witness history. Some held up signs. "Families over fraud. HOA power abuse ends today. Justice for Sophie." Mason Hartwell sat in the front row, his uniform immaculate once again, his jaw set like a locked door. Beside him, Sophie clutched a worn stuffed unicorn in her lap, a small anchor in a world that had spun too hard and too fast for a little girl to understand. But she wasn't hiding anymore. She was watching, learning, because justice wasn't just a word her father said. It was something he did. At the defendant's table, Paul Denton looked nothing like the arrogant HOA president who once sneered over late lawn mowing violations. Now he was pale, sagging, his hands trembling where they gripped the edge of the table. Roger, Redbeard Harris, the thug who had ripped Sophie off her bike, sat next to him, chains rattling every time he shifted. His bravado had vanished, leaving only sullen fear. Vincent Shaw, the so-called mastermind behind Community Integrity Force, stared straight ahead, face blank. Calculating, waiting. But Mason saw the tension in the set of his shoulders. The cracks were already spider-webbing through his armor. The prosecution didn't waste time. They called Mason to the stand first. As he rose and walked to the witness box, a hush fell over the room. He raised his right hand, swore to tell the truth, and sat down with the kind of stillness that made even the judge straighten up a little taller. The prosecutor, a sharp-eyed woman named Dana Moreno, approached slowly. "Colonel Hartwell," she began, "in your own words, tell us what happened on that day." Mason's voice never wavered. He described the SUV without plates, the fake uniforms, the abduction, the taser, the neighbors too shocked to react. The silence afterward, heavier than any battlefield he'd ever survived. He described waking up with dirt in his mouth and fear in his veins, knowing Sophie was gone. And he described what came next. How he had refused to wait for broken systems to catch up. How he had tracked them down. How he had rescued his daughter not with fury, but with methodical, relentless justice. He laid out every piece of evidence. The fake Community Integrity Force documents, the wire transfers, the recordings of board members trading safety for kickbacks. By the time he finished, you could hear people in the gallery weeping openly. Dana Moreno stepped closer. "Colonel Hartwell," she said quietly, "what do you believe these men were really doing?" Mason didn't hesitate. "They were using the illusion of authority to terrorize civilians," he said. "They weaponized trust. They created fear where there should have been safety. And they sold our peace, our children's peace, for profit." He looked straight at the jury. "And if we don't stop them here," he said, voice like iron, "they won't be the last." The defense tried to claw back ground. Denton's lawyer painted him as misled, claiming Paul Denton hadn't known about the abductions, that he thought it was just enhanced compliance. Harris's lawyer stammered through a half-hearted excuse about miscommunication and misunderstanding. Shaw's attorney tried the old strategy of blame everyone else. But it didn't matter. The evidence Mason had built was a wall no lie could climb. The wire transfers. The secret recordings. The testimonies from other homeowners, now emboldened to come forward, tales of threats, fines, fake inspections, and bribes demanded behind closed doors. One elderly man broke down on the stand describing how they tried to take his late wife's home over a weed violation. Another mother described her autistic son being terrified when strangers pounded on their door demanding payment. Each story another nail hammered into the defendants' coffins. When it came time for sentencing, Judge Callahan, a sharp, no-nonsense woman who had lost none of her compassion over her years on the bench, didn't hold back. She stared down at Denton, Harris, and Shaw with undisguised contempt. "You terrorized the very people you were entrusted to protect," she said. "You used bureaucracy like a weapon, greed as your compass, and fear as your currency." Her voice rose, cutting through the courtroom like a lash. "You preyed on the vulnerable. You endangered children. You betrayed every principle this nation stands for. And you did it with smiles on your faces and lies on your tongues." She slammed the gavel down hard enough to echo. "I sentence you each to the maximum allowable penalties under law, consecutive terms for every charge. You will not see freedom again in your natural lives." Paul Denton collapsed into sobs. Redbeard Harris screamed incoherently as marshals dragged him away. Vincent Shaw simply bowed his head, the last sliver of his empire crumbling to dust around him. Outside the courthouse, a celebration erupted. Neighbors who once barely nodded at each other embraced like old friends. Children played on the courthouse lawn without fear. Reporters shouted questions Mason refused to answer. This wasn't about fame. It never had been. He knelt by Sophie instead, tying her shoelace where it had come loose, smiling quietly as she laughed, a sound purer and louder now, no longer muffled by fear. That night, the community met under the stars at the Silver Lake Meadows Central Park. No microphones. No stages. Just people. They voted, unanimously, to dissolve the old HOA charter, to build a new community association based on transparency and actual neighborly care. No fines without community approval. No enforcement without clear authority. No secrets. They elected a new board, residents who had nothing to gain but pride in their homes and love for their neighbors. Mason refused the offer to lead it. "I didn't fight to become a politician," he said, smiling softly. "I fought so you wouldn't need soldiers on your own streets." As the crowd dispersed, Sophie tugged on Mason's sleeve. "Are the bad guys all gone, Daddy?" Mason lifted her into his arms, her head resting against his chest. "For now," he said. Then he kissed her forehead. "And if they ever come back, we'll be ready." Above them, the stars burned clean and clear, the same stars Mason had stared at from bases and bunkers around the world, promising himself that someday, somehow, he'd find a place worth protecting. Tonight, he had. And he wasn't leaving. Not ever again. Peace, Mason learned, was never permanent. It was something you fought for, nurtured, guarded like a fragile flame in a storm. The arrests, the trial, the community's rebirth, they weren't the end of the story. They were only the beginning. Because for every Paul Denton exposed, there were a dozen more hiding behind HOA seals and compliance codes across America. For every Sophie rescued, there were children still living in fear behind freshly painted fences. Mason knew that better than anyone. And he wasn't the kind of man to leave a battlefield half-won. A week after the verdict, Mason met Langston at a diner off the highway, the kind with cracked vinyl booths, strong coffee, and old veterans who still tipped their hats at the door. Langston dropped into the seat across from him, sliding a battered manila folder across the Formica tabletop. "You're not gonna believe this," Langston said, jerking his thumb at the folder. Mason flipped it open. Inside, articles clipped from small-town papers, screenshots from neighborhood forums, affidavits from terrified homeowners. All telling the same story. Unauthorized fines. Private compliance squads operating without government oversight. Families threatened, silenced, pushed out of their homes. A pattern. A cancer. And not just in Colorado. Texas. Florida. Nevada. Arizona. It was spreading. Langston leaned in, voice low. "You thinking what I'm thinking?" Mason's jaw tightened. He wasn't just thinking it. He was already planning it. That night, Mason stood on his porch as the sun bled red into the Rockies. Sophie played in the driveway, her laugh cutting through the cooling air like a song of hope. A few neighbors worked in their yards, not because they were afraid of citations, but because they took pride in their homes. The world felt right. For now. But Mason's mind was already elsewhere. He pulled out his phone, scrolling through contacts. He wasn't just going to defend Silver Lake Meadows. He was going to defend every community that needed it. The idea started small, a task force. A network of veterans, former law enforcement, cybersecurity experts, and legal specialists. People who understood what real protection meant. People who had seen firsthand how bureaucracy could be twisted into a weapon against the innocent. They called it Project Sentinel. Its mission was simple. Expose fake HOA operations. Shut down illegal enforcement groups. Educate homeowners about their rights. Fight, legally and tactically, to protect communities nationwide. The first months were hard. There were threats. Anonymous emails warning Mason to stay out of places he didn't belong. Anonymous letters suggesting that Sophie might not stay safe next time. Mason responded the only way he knew how. By doubling down. He trained new recruits. He built legal templates to fight fraudulent HOA actions. He even collaborated with investigative journalists to shine a national spotlight on systemic abuses. And as the movement grew, Mason became something more than a retired colonel. He became a symbol. The HOA general, they called him online. Memes sprang up. Mason in sunglasses with the caption, "Compliance? I'll show you compliance." Sophie holding a flag with the words, "Protected by Dad, protected by law." Petitions surged. Laws were proposed. Neighborhoods that once trembled before corrupt HOA boards began standing together, stronger, braver. Mason didn't seek the spotlight, but he accepted the responsibility that came with it, because he understood something the criminals never did. You can't bully a soldier. You can't scare a father. And you sure as hell can't steal peace from people who are willing to fight for it. One evening, months later, after another successful operation dismantling a fraudulent compliance group in Arizona, Mason found himself once again on his porch, watching Sophie ride her bike. She was different now. Taller. Stronger. More careful, but not fearful. She had scars on her knees and a stubborn set to her chin that made Mason smile. Life had left its marks on her, but it hadn't broken her. Not even close. Sophie skidded to a stop at the foot of the porch, panting and laughing. "Guess what, Daddy?" she called out. He raised an eyebrow. "What's that?" "I beat Ricky and Jordan in a race," she beamed. "And guess what else?" He grinned. "Tell me." "I'm not scared anymore," she said simply. Mason swallowed hard, blinking into the sunset. "Good," he said roughly. "That's exactly how it should be." She dropped her bike and sprinted up the steps, throwing her arms around his waist. He hugged her back fiercely, lifting her off the ground. And as he stood there, holding his daughter against his chest, Mason Hartwell knew. The world wasn't perfect. It never would be. But as long as there were people willing to stand up and fight, as long as there were fathers who refused to bow, as long as there were kids brave enough to laugh again, there was hope. There was always hope. And Mason Hartwell would never stop fighting to protect it. Not now. Not ever.